Hello, I'm Kelly Richardson, the CCIM President-elect for the Washington State Chapter. Welcome to today's webinar, Economic Update for Commercial Real Estate Professionals. Joining us for today's discussion is CCIM Institute Chief Economist, Conway. Casey is going to share his insights on what to expect as we come out of the pandemic and begin to get back to business not so usual, including some specific to this region. Please feel free to ask questions throughout using the Q&A tab. You can also upvote any questions that have been asked by other attendees. We'll be answering as many as we can at the end of the discussion. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature to help with that. This recording and the slides will be available after the session. Casey, welcome. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. Home for me originally is your region. I grew up in Colorado, so it's great to be back home in the right region here. So we'll just jump right into it here. So it'll be a little bit of a drink like from the fire hose. So we'll go ahead and advance the first slide. There's the cover. We'll go on to the next one. There's my normal disclaimer. These are all my crazy thoughts. You guys are all insulated. It's all me. Send the lawyer notices to me. Next slide. All right, so you know that I always like to start off with a good reading recommendation, or got to do it if you're in university world. So I have two books that I think help frame our discussion today. The first one was given to me by a fellow CCIM in North Carolina, Karen Minkowski, called Seussisms by Dr. Seuss. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Seuss. I think if we go back and read more Dr. Seuss, the world would be a better place. So a couple of chapters I felt that were relevant in this book are listen to good advice and surround yourself with good people. And that's what we are here in the CCIM Institute. Lots of good people we've surrounded ourselves with, the relationship side. The other one is another book by one of our other CCIM colleagues, Jim Baker from Indiana. And Jim published this book earlier this year, and it's a great book. I keep it on my desk, look at it every morning when I get going. It's kind of written like a calendar, and it talks about what were the most memorable things in his career, what he learned, life lessons, and tips for all of us as we go through. So his June 17th item was, his lesson for today is fools lose tomorrow. Sorry, my screen's moving around on me here. Fools lose tomorrow, reaching back for yesterday. So we're not going back to the future. We're going to go forward today. And that's been my kind of mantra from the beginning of this whole crisis, is look up and forward. So those are my reading recommendations. They're light, and I think you can still sleep after reading them. Next slide. All right, so I'm actually writing a piece on this today, an update. Back on May 13th, I wrote my first one called Are We There Yet? And it was following the first CCIM Region Chapter, a webinar I did for Region 2, and Sharon Carr's out in California, and she came up with a theme, Are We There Yet? And I added the picture of, remember when we were kids and we'd bug mom and dad in our predecessor to the minivan, our station wagon with the phony wood paneling, and they'd pack us in the station wagon and off we'd go on a trip, and we'd ask every 30 minutes, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And that's what we really want to know after all that we've been through here. So let's I'll tell you, on May 13th, I was definitive. We were not here yet. But some data that we've had in the last week really has me wondering, well, maybe we're getting there at least. So if you look back on, June 11th, the Dow had plunged 1,800 points. We had the Fed chair speak and talk about how awful things were. And then we got the June 16th retail sales the other day, and retail sales were up 17.7%, saying, we're here, and maybe with the jobs report, we're here as well. So let's dig into it and see if we're really there or if we're just getting there a little bit. Next slide. All right, so let's start with the jobs report. Now, most of you know that I characterized the BLS jobs reports even before COVID as a formula, BLS minus L equals BS, barbecue sauce. They don't really know how to count labor. So let's look at the April number. And the April number We saw just an unimaginable 20.5 million people lose their jobs in 1 month. Are you kidding me? We saw unemployment go over 20%, to double what it was in the 2009 financial crisis. And it just wasn't retail and hospitality workers losing their jobs. We saw in April a record 2.1 million professional and business service jobs on the left. So I called the April jobs report the Humpty Dumpty jobs report. Jobs had a great fall, and now it's up to the Fedsmen and the CEOs to put Humpty Dumpty jobs back together. Then we fast forward to May, and we look at our May report, and they said, we don't know what was going on in April. We don't know who those people were putting that number together. We created 2.5 million jobs. What are you talking about? And the unemployment rate went down. And so I'm scratching my head going, all right, when nobody in America, I mean, literally nobody got the May jobs numbers right, something's wrong here. So I've kind of reflected on it, and here's what I think's going on. It's not all the BLS's fault. Remember what happened in March. We passed a CARES bill. And in the CARES bill, for the first time ever, we included 1099 workers and sole proprietors in unemployment. So we counted them. We've never done that before, and we extended unemployment insurance benefits to them. And I think that is what led to the distortion and maybe the exaggeration of the 20.5 million unemployed. And it's also what's caused, I think, the distortion in May, saying that they all went away and they all got hired. Because to stay on unemployment insurance, you have to be actively seeking work, full-time work. Well, if you're a sole proprietor or a 1099 contractor, how in the world are you actively seeking work when you can't even go out? You're sheltered in place and the states aren't reopened. So what happens is the BLS said, well, 9 million of you, you just disappear. Go away. You don't exist anymore. So they got rid of 9 million workers from the workforce. Well, that kind of makes sense then why we could have plus 2.5 million. If you get rid of 9 million, if you net them out, you still probably lost 6 or 7 million jobs. So I think that's part of what's going on. We have huge distortions in the labor market and the numbers because of the CARES bill. So I've always looked at the ADP number in the lower right there. And ADP tracks private payrolls, what we're doing in the private sector. And it's not a survey, it's an actual count. They're doing the payroll processing, so they really know what's going on. And ADP told us in May, for the May jobs report, you lost another 2.7 million jobs. And I think that's probably spot on and pretty consistent. I think we have a long ways to go. And what I want you to focus on is up there, my first point under the BLS jobs report on the right, the real unemployment rate, the U6. Now in America, we make up lots of things. We make up 6 unemployment numbers, but the real one, the total count of everybody is called the U6, and it's at over 21%. Put that in perspective. That's double the worst that it got in the Great Recession. So this tells me I'm not buying this Kool-Aid, and I didn't buy into the jobs report. Next slide. All right, what about May retail sales? This one I think actually has some legs to it. So we got this yesterday and put them in contrast here between April and May. So the April number, we saw that we had the biggest decline ever in retail sales. Well, that made sense. We all were at home and we couldn't go out to the malls or go shopping or go to the beach or go anywhere. So that was a pretty big number. And then in May, they said we just set a new record. It was the biggest increase in any month, 17.7%. But I want you to focus on, there's the chart down there in the bottom, but focus to the left. Many retail categories, even though they're up tremendously in this latest report, like apparel, it's up 188% over April. It's still down 63% from a year ago. So you got to put these numbers in perspective. And what they say about statistics and percentages, they can make anybody a liar or true sayer, depending on how you put it in perspective. The apparel retail fundamentals have not changed at all, and many others. But there are some other areas. This is good news that we're improving, but we have a long, long way to go. And if you think that retail store closings and all that are going to stop, I think you're going to be disappointed. Next slide. All right. So this is one that I think reinforces my belief that the retail sales numbers are much more believable than the May jobs numbers. We have companies that are starting to reinstate their dividends. I mean, wait, should I restate that? Companies reinstating their dividends? And not only is it just some companies, but it's a retail company. So many of you know Dick's Sporting Goods. Growing up in Denver, we knew the original Dick's Sporting Goods store was a was the old Gart Brothers store down near downtown, the Sports Castle. But Dick's reported really good information this week on its earnings and jobs. And what it told us is it's reopened all of its stores. It's seeing really strong purchase activity, especially if anybody want a bicycle, forget it. You can't find any bicycles anywhere in America. We bought them all up. Sporting goods, tennis rackets, golf clubs, you can't find them. And so they're confident enough to reinstate their dividend. So when we see, if somebody asked me a month ago when we would see a retailer reinstate a dividend, I would have said, what day am I dying and going on to the afterlife? So this is really good and encouraging news type stuff on that side. So let's go on to the next slide. So now I'm going to take you back down. So you're on your medications, you feel good, you feel bad. I'm going to make you feel bad now. So I look a lot at what they're looking at all the banks, they're talking to their banks, they're deep in there digging the numbers out. And they produce what's called a financial stability report periodically. And their latest one said, we're really worried about commercial real estate, that yellow arrow off to the left. And they said, we think, we've been listening to Casey, the Red Shoe economist, and we think he's right, that we're going to undergo a substantial repricing of all commercial real estate. What's a restaurant worth when it can only have 60% of the seats and tables open? What's a hotel worth when it can only have maximum 50% occupancy? And believe it or not, there are states and jurisdictions now that are putting permanent occupancy restrictions in place, like 50% on hotels. So we really need to worry about it. The Fed chair testified yesterday to the Senate, and he's testifying this afternoon to the House Banking Committee. And he reinforced that he's not feeling so great. He thinks that we have a long way to go. I think he's right. And he said, look, the Fed predicts the after effects of the virus could hamper economic growth well into the future. Strains on household and business balance sheets will create fragilities that will last for some time. And that's the point I think we need to know, that even though we're open up businesses and we try to reopen up activity, business and consumer balance sheets, household balance sheets have been very, very damaged, that are going to constrain whether we buy cars, whether we buy new homes, whether we go on trips. And so on the right there, I put the remaining FOMC meeting schedule. So we have one coming up in July, and we don't have one in August. So that's the time to plan a vacation. Go get in the car, go to the mountains. You got lots of great geography there in your region. Go outside, enjoy August, because September is really going to be ugly. We'll start to get new earnings reports. We'll get into the elections. I don't think any of us are going to like the fall, but anyway, we'll get beyond that. Next slide. So here's the Fed chairman. He doesn't look so happy, does he? So he said in his May briefing that, we're not moving rates until 2022. Now he may be rethinking that a little bit. If we get a strong recovery next year, he may have to walk that back a little bit. So that's proof you should never, what do they say in forecasting? You can forecast anything, just never give a number or a date to what you forecast. So here's his stuff from just yesterday and this week, where he says, look, my message is an uncertain path. We have a long ways to go. There's acute risks for small business in particular. And I think that's a key point, that 65% of our economy is driven by small business, and they have been hurt the hardest. Sole proprietors, all those 1099 and workers and sole proprietors. So I think we have a long way to go in restoring the health of small business, and they occupy about a little bit more than 65% of all of our commercial real estate is a small business, not a big corporation. So very big, very important to us in commercial real estate. Next slide. So how about oil prices? You guys don't know anything about energy and oil prices out in your region, do you? There's no fracking going on. There's no other issues, no solar or wind power, any of that type stuff. So here's where we've gone in energy. We started the year off at $60 a barrel oil. It fell to minus 40. I want to reassure you that I have not met anybody or found any evidence that the Saudis or Russians or anybody else was paying anybody $40 a barrel to take their oil. They might have been paying that much to store it, but it was really a reflection of futures contracts and a lesson in what can happen on prices of commodities with futures contracts. But we climbed back to $40 a barrel here a week ago. But we're starting to see fragility in that and it come back. And the main reason is we basically got Russia and China to agree to production cuts, or I'm sorry, not China, Saudi Arabia. And that's brought our supply down. But now they're seeing this recovery. and they're seeing that everybody else is producing oil. So they said, why not us? So if everybody pulls off their production cuts and restraints and starts producing again, we're going to go back to $20, $25 a barrel oil. I think the message is, regardless the number, it's going to be volatile. And that's very difficult for, I think, the Rocky Mountain region, Texas, the areas that, have shale regions and do fracking and are energy dependent. So I don't think energy is going to settle down at all. Next slide. So here's the one that really drives me home on why we're not there. So I recommend the Johns Hopkins University website. They're the best in the country. They're very politically neutral. They provide just good factual information with no spin on it. They great graphics and maps like I've given here. So when I put this deck together, we were over 8 million, almost 8.1 million cases. We're going to top 8.5 million this weekend. Or by this weekend. Put that in perspective, globally, we didn't even have 1 million cases on April 1st. And we're now 8 times that number just 2.5 months later. So the number of cases is not slowing down. So we've reopened everything up, but the cases are still there. Look at Arizona. Arizona's dealing with the challenge of its highest daily case counts. Florida, Texas, they're all doing it. So we have more cases than anywhere in the world. And that's because China doesn't count them. They never did. But we've got about 25% of the world's cases. So do you think anybody in the rest of the world is going to let us travel to visit them? Do you think any of you are going to be able to go to Europe this summer? Forget it. We're the toxic entity in the world. No one's going to let us come near them. So that's going to affect business travel, airlines, a lot of business. And you look at state rankings. So you can see New York, New Jersey, California, and Illinois are at the top being worse. Then you got Texas near you. You got Florida, Georgia. If you look at Arizona, they're number 18. I think Arizona could move into the top 10 in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Colorado, you're at number 21. That's because you have all that great fresh air. You go outside, and someone told me recently that they felt that the coronavirus could not exist in mountain air. And so I said, let me check with the people in Colorado and CCIMs in Colorado to see if that's true. But Wyoming, Hawaii, and Alaska, you're the 5 lowest, you're among the 5, in Montana, the 5 lowest number of cases in the country. So if you want to go where it's safe, go to up Colorado, go up to I-25 to Wyoming, use your frequent flyer points to go out to Hawaii, take a trip up to Alaska or Montana. But I think you're going to find their governors are going to tell you what Florida's been telling New York: do not come here and infect us. So what we want to look like is Hawaii there in the lower left. They basically saw their apex, and they've really almost eradicated the cases. And that's until we all come visit them with our frequent flyer points. I encourage you to look at this map, not to scare you in these statistics, but to keep in perspective what's happening around your state. Because as you open for business and you re-engage in commerce, you kind of need to know what's going on to your right, left, north, and south, because that may cause the infection to outbreak in your state. So be aware of what's going on around you and know that we have a long way to go and we still don't have a vaccine. Next slide. So here's the Fed intervention. This tells me that we're not there yet. If we were there yet, the Fed would be pulling its horns back in, but they're not. Keep in mind that in the financial crisis, the Great Recession, the Fed ballooned its balance sheet to a record $4.3 to $4.5 trillion. We were freaked out by that. That balance sheet got whittled down under $4 trillion by the beginning of this year. That has exploded not only to $7 trillion, but in the last 2 weeks, it's gone to $7.2 trillion. And Chairman Powell said, look, guys, I think we need more support. I'm willing to throw another $2.8 to $3 trillion in and take it to $10 trillion. And if we need to take it to $20 trillion, I'll do that. Put in focus what $10 trillion is. That's almost a half a year of GDP. So when the revised GDP numbers come out and the new ones for the second quarter, don't look for 30 and 40% declines in GDP. We've put in, through intervention, the equivalent of everything we lost. So GDP decline shouldn't be that dramatic. It should stay in a -5 to max maybe 10% decline. But this Fed intervention tells me the Fed sees through its bank lenses how much damage is done, and we have a long ways to go. Next slide. So here's where it really hits home. This is from the Tax Foundation, and it looks at how states are fiscally and how well funded their unemployment insurance funds are. So you see the blue bars, the long extending ones at the top and the dashed black line going vertical there. If you're to the right, if your blue bar is to the right of that vertical dashed line, you're in pretty good shape. That means you have more than a year of unemployment insurance savings and rainy day funds. And this is why Wyoming doesn't want you to come up there, not only to bring the virus, but also to draw their unemployment. Wyoming is probably one of the best states in the country. They have over a year, so almost a year and a half of unemployment insurance in their trust. This chart shows about 2.5 years. You can see Alaska's good, Utah's good, Idaho's good, Montana's good. Uh-oh, who's messing up? So the same people with all the virus. Arizona and Colorado, go down even further to Texas. So, I guess all of those cannabis taxes didn't go for unemployment insurance funding. They went somewhere else. But I point this out because this is why we're reopening. States don't have the fiscal ability to stay sheltered in place in perpetuity. If then they run out of unemployment insurance, they have to borrow from the federal government. That happened in 2009 and 10, and it took most states 5 years to repay those obligations. We're already seeing municipalities go bankrupt. So in the South, we were the first to do it. In Alabama, we had our first city, suburb of Birmingham, filed bankruptcy last month, Chapter 9. I unfortunately think we're going to see many more. And the reason is, if you look over there on the left, the Fed has said they're starting, their number one source of intervention going forward in June is going to be to buy municipal bonds. And the biggest issuer is the New York Mass Transit Authority, and they just bought an ungodly amount of those bonds to keep them supported. The problem in the CARES Act is that in the states that were eligible for municipal bond support were only those with more than 500,000 in population, the cities with more than 500,000 in population. So that was only 36 cities. We have over 360 MSAs in the country, so barely 10% are getting municipal bond support. And when you look at the devastation in small business, it's a big one. Think about college towns. So think about in Wyoming and Idaho and Montana and Colorado, Fort Collins, Colorado Springs. Think of Grand Junction. Think of all your, your college towns. We have 138 college towns that play NCAA Division I football, and they have been devastated. They didn't get financial support. Universities have had to rebate fees and housing funds. The small businesses didn't get commencement season, so it really dramatically hit. So I worry most on our small side about college towns, and I think we could see really a bucket of municipal bankruptcies being related to college towns. Next slide. So this is an article that just played in Allentown, Pennsylvania, that highlighted what I just shared with you. The CARES Act limited participation to only those 36 cities that had more than 500,000 in population. The need is quite dire. This is where we go bump in the night. If utilities and transportation and airports and all those things don't function and those bonds default, we have real infrastructure problems, and that has huge domino effect to commercial real estate. So, Kansas City is building a new airport right now. Denver's rebuilding the new airport that replaced the DIA airport. Fortunately, Salt Lake recently finished their upgrade to their airport. But we have a lot of airport infrastructure and rail infrastructure that has bond funding in it in your region of the country that we need to worry about. Next slide. So one of the things I do beyond all this wonderful government data to really help guide me and anchor me is I look at earnings. And I'm reminded of a Winston Churchill quote that he had late in his career and late in his life after listening to everybody lie to him over the years. He basically said, I no longer listen to what people say, I just watch what they do. Behavior never lies. And that's why I study corporate earnings, is because under penalty of perjury with SEC filed documents, even though they're not giving forward guidance, companies are telling us through their behavior what they're doing. They're suspending CapEx expenditures, they're laying people off, they're opening or not opening stores. Look at Dick's Sporting Goods, we're reinstating our dividend. There's a lot of behavior in these earnings, and that's why I study them. Next slide. So we covered these. Some of you may have been able to attend this. Some of you may have missed it. But last month, Eddie Blanton, our global CCIM president, and I were able to do a town hall kind of recapping what we learned from first quarter earnings. So the CCIM communications team did a great job. No matter how you want to find this information, you can get it on YouTube to listen, to go for a walk, or you can get the slides. The links are right here if you missed that or you want to replay it. Next slide. So in that town hall, I gave Eddie my Cliff Notes. I gave him my secret sauce. Now y'all are going to know my secret barbecue sauce. So here's how I look at corporate earnings. And what I want to reassure all CCIMs is you don't need to be a freshly minted MBA, or you don't need to be experienced in reading 10Q and 10K SEC filed reports on earnings. There's an easy way to get to what I learned. So the first thing is find a couple of free sources that track them. So a couple that I use are Seeking Alpha and StockEarnings.com. StockEarnings.com has a free calendar alert. You can sign up for specific companies or industries, and as earnings season starts, they'll send you calendar reminders with links to the earnings as they're released. So it's a real good resource. I also encourage folks to identify those companies that are really relevant to your community, your city, your state, that really drive your economy, and or maybe your tenants in your buildings or your clients' buildings. Those are the ones you should be looking at. So if you pull and look for those companies, either in the calendar alerts in stockearnings.com, or you just go to their website. So look at ABC Region 1 company, go to their website. This is one I give you MREIC at the top. I'm on the board of directors for this public REIT. We, like most companies, have a really good website. We put everything there under our investor relations tab. So just go to the investor relations tab, the presentations, the transcripts, everything is right there, so you don't have to go to those really challenging 10Q and 10K reports. And when you go there, focus on the earnings transcript and go right to the end. Step 4, go right to the end of the Q&A session of all these earnings calls. And the analysts have great questions, and they put the CEOs on the spot to answer the questions. And I'll give you in step 5 a really good example of the kind of nuggets or information that are buried here. So many of you may have a Container Store in your market or your cities or states. And Container Store revealed that of the 50 stores that they have not been able to reopen, of their 90-something total, that the ones they've reopened, they found that they do well if they have a click it and pick up capability. And what they mean by that is Container Store went inline in shopping centers. They weren't an end cap. They didn't have drive-through like a dry cleaners or a branch bank. And so it's very difficult to do online click it and pick up. The parking spaces are at the front of the store. You can't block the drive, that maybe there's only a limited driveway through there. So they said they have actually memorialized a click it and pick up policy in their site selection criteria. And their CEO said, look, we're not going to keep stores. We're not going to open new ones that don't have a click it and pick up strategy or capability. And that got me thinking about how retail is going to change in terms of how it looks and parking and all that. I'll give you an example. I've got a major grocer here in the Southeast that is finding that about 30% of its sales are online. And it doesn't need that much parking, but it does need drive-up lanes to do click it and pick up, just like a fast food restaurant. So they're trying to go to local city and counties to get permission in their zoning to eliminate a third of the parking. It requires a zoning change. And they're having to do all kinds of things to quantify it, improve it, and maybe even have appraisals or an expert consultant come in and let them know that it's not going to mess up everything else. This is an opportunity for CCIMs to use their skills in a consulting service while you wait for transactions to come back. So I share this nugget not only because it's going to reveal something different about how we do retail site selection, but it could be an opportunity for you to maybe do some consulting work as you go forward. You got great grocers like King Soopers and Safeway in your part of the world, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods. So lots of great opportunities. Next slide. So this slide, I just want to go to the yellow arrow. The one thing I want you to be thinking about, because the industry is going to draw on the CCIM Institute, our instructors and you as professionals in your communities, we are going to have to rethink everything about commercial real estate. Density ratios for things like office. I don't think we're going back to, we're going to maintain less than 200 square feet per worker. What about restaurants? If they now have health department occupancy restrictions in addition to fire department, what does that mean? Think about our expense ratios. We're going to spend more in terms of CapEx spend for everything to go touchless? We're going to spend more on extra cleaning and janitorial. Do you think that office buildings are going to be able to operate with janitorial service, just cleaning the restrooms at lunchtime and at the end of the day? Try every hour. Think about what that does to your expense ratios and your occupancy costs. So we're gonna really have to be thinking about that, and I think we're the best positioned to help our communities and our clients and our industry rethink this number. Next slide. Let's see. Did we get stuck? Might be a little bit of lag sometimes on these slides. I guess everybody loves this slide. Sometimes there's a little for you, Kelly.
That's right, there can be. So Casey, while we have a little bit of time, we have a question from our audience member. ADP is a big company in payroll processing. Are they reporting their numbers only? Do they talk with Paychex or any other payroll companies?
So I look at Paychex separately, but it's a good one. ADP is the largest. So I view them as a really good proxy. And it's like I said, it's not a survey. They're sharing the numbers on everybody they process payrolls on. Paychex does a lot more small business. So I look at Paychex as well to look at kind of what's going on in the small business segment within ADP, where ADP will be more larger type companies. But great question that look at Paychex as well, especially if you want to see what's more granular at the small business level.
Okay, very good.
We may need to go back one slide. Let me see. Let's see. Go back one more. One more. Let's see. Go back a couple more. I guess we got off. Yeah, go back a couple more. It advanced pretty quickly. All right, we'll just end our earnings here. So one question that's coming up in earnings, are we all going to go to the suburbs? I think a lot more of us will. I think suburbs are going to be a big beneficiary of the COVID virus. Equifax told us companies are going to absorb what's called redundancy costs. They'll pay their office leases in their big downtown towers, like in Phoenix and Denver and what's the big high-rise office market in Montana? Is there one? It's probably something to dealing with ranching, right? But they're going to pay those, but they're already looking for leasing smaller chunks of suburban space to allow their teammates to have meetings and client stuff that are more conference rooms. So I think the suburbs are going to be a big beneficiary. And we're seeing a number of entities, home builders like D.R. Horton are saying the biggest cohort of traffic is young professionals from the cities, you know, in San Francisco, even Denver, Atlanta, you know, Phoenix, that are going out to the suburbs to buy a house and get out of the downtown market. Next slide. So I just here, these are a couple papers that we've written at the Institute. They're great for your clients. It may become more valuable. The Institute was great in their leadership in creating this Insight series a couple, 2.5 years ago. And we partnered to produce this adaptive reuse paper that's totally valid today. I think it's going to become more in focus as we figure all this stuff that doesn't reopen. And then Retail Evolution that we published last fall in San Diego just changed the dates from 2025 to 2021 and 2022, and the paper's current. We've accelerated everything online by 3 to 5 years. But these are great papers. I encourage you to go back and look at. Next slide. Like it's freezing up a couple of times for us, right? You're doing great, Kelly. It's just the technology. It's just sometimes the technology, there's a lag in what we've got. It'll kick in a minute.
And Casey, where do you see banking liquidity heading?
So the Fed is going to keep the banks very liquid. That's a good question. They don't want to see a housing foreclosure thing develop again. They want to see credit flowing. If the Fed's intervening and they're buying mortgages and they're buying stocks and now they're buying non-investment grade company bond debt, what the Fed is saying is we want everybody to stay liquid. We want capital flow. So they're going to get pretty upset. There we go. If the banks lock up liquidity. So if you notice, compared to the Great Recession, the banks haven't locked up people's lines of credit. They've still been receiving applications and lending. So I'm hopeful we're going to see something very different from the banks than we did in 2009. I think the liquidity, the process and the application process and timing is going to get slower because the banks are overwhelmed. The PPP program, PP1, 2, 3, now the Main Street funding, they don't have the resources, and they're making no money with interest rates near zero. The banks aren't making any interest rate spread, so their costs are going up, their net interest margins going down. So I think they're going to have challenges 6 months to a year down the road in terms of profitability. So some other things I'm looking at here. You remember that station wagon with that phony wood paneling? If mom and dad couldn't get us to be quiet as kids by rolling down the tailgate window to let carbon monoxide fumes in to put us to sleep, their plan B was they gave us a car bingo card. We now have these electronic, and we would have to look out the window for certain things. So I'm going to tell you my car bingo card for economics. And I'll give you here the 4 slots, and the key one is that center slot, because if you can get the center slot, you almost always win bingo. So around the center slot in the upper left corner, transportation metrics. So these, if things aren't moving, the economy is not moving. So I look at these, whether it's rail traffic or truck traffic, I look at those. But here's one, I'm going to give you just one that is probably my most significant and important metric to follow that will tell you how we get there and at what pace. And it's the Tsa Passenger Count. So TSA counts how many of us go through the airport every day. And going into March, we had 2.3 million of us going through our airports in the United States. And that fell to about 85,000 in April. And here's the good news. We're seeing that recover even at a pace quicker than I thought, just 2 to 3 weeks into all states being reopened. We're seeing that now in the last several days surpass 500,000 passengers a day. We need to get that back to 1.5 million to 1.8 million a day to save the airlines and our hotel industry. But this is a very encouraging sign that I was worried was not going to recover this quickly. So that's a good one. Small business. Down there in the lower left corner, follow small business. That's 60%, 65% of our economy. The National Federation of Independent Business gave us some encouragement this past week that actually small businesses are getting a little happier. But when you get to open, instead of just be closed and wondering when you're going to go bankrupt, you do get a little more optimistic. But the numbers are in the 80 range. That's worse than they were at the bottom of the Obama administration. So in perspective, while it's getting better, the record highs were during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, where the readings went like to 108 or more. So follow that. Follow the National Restaurant Association. They're telling us that 40% of all restaurants are gone. They've already closed up. They've already left. They have all their employees. They just haven't been able to get to a state or city agency to file the paperwork of unincorporation. So that data is not making it up to the federal government or the state level yet. On the far upper right, student aid applications, those are collapsing. That shouldn't be the case. College education hasn't gotten cheaper since COVID, although maybe the online is cheaper. But we're finding that high school graduating students aren't applying for financial student aid like they did a year ago. And the reason probably is mom and dad's balance sheet is scarred. Mom and dad, one or both, have lost their job or are furloughed. And they're saying to the student, look, I can't do it next year. We may have to defer college a year. You can't even get a job right now to help pay or an assistantship or internship. I have 2 college-age daughters in that same boat. The lower one that really concerns me, that's a bellwether for next year, is the number of homes and mortgages that are in forbearance. The high water mark was 1% during the Great Recession, and we're already at 8%. 8% of all mortgages are in some form of loan forbearance for 6 to 12 months. And when those come off next spring, we're really going to see what's happening to housing. In addition to that, I'll have a slide a little bit later here that shows mortgages in delinquencies is also up. It's gone from 3% to 6%. So the reality is about 15% of all of our mortgages in this country. So think of that, almost 1 in 5. So if you go down your street, every 5th house, someone's in a forbearance or delinquent situation where they can't pay their mortgage. That is, you got to go back to Great Depression days to see those numbers. So that's why I don't think we're there yet. Next slide. Here's the center slot in the bingo card. It's real estate transaction activity. Real Capitalytics does a great job. They were showing us a month ago in April that the transaction activity hadn't really slowed. But this last month they showed it was starting to look more like Europe and Asia, but for a very different reason. And that's on this next slide. I want you to understand the reason why. So I wrote this piece a couple of weeks ago. The Pension Real Estate Association. This is called PREA, and it represents all the large pension and institution funds in the United States that invest in commercial real estate. And they only invest about $2.5 trillion in our commercial real estate, just chump change. More than half of what the Fed's balance sheet was before COVID. And they have a little accounting problem coming up at the end of this month. Each quarter, they have to mark to market their portfolios and the value of that real estate. They didn't do anything in the first quarter because we really didn't understand the situation or have any data to do it. We now know the tentacles, and we know things are bad in hotel and retail and restaurant. So at the end of between now and the end of June, the 500 largest funds have said, we're doing no real estate transaction activity. We got to figure out our marks and what we got to mark things down and save. And then we're going to have to reallocate where we put money to work. And that money is going to come back to work in August and September. It may be less in hotels and retail and a lot more in multifamily and warehouse or logistics, supply chain. So what I would encourage you to do is understand the why is as important as the number. And that this capital is coming back to work, I think, this fall. And I would encourage all CCIMs to be working their institutional real estate pension fund relationships to be in a position so when they put requests out to say, we're looking for 200 million, 500 million, $1 billion of multifamily to buy or invest in, and we want to diversify that, and we want 15% of that to be in region 1, that you guys are ready to respond. This is going to be an opportunity that's going to come into the hands, I think in particular, of CCIMs and commercial real estate brokers this fall. So this is some good news that I think will happen. And the reason it's going to come back is this funding source needs yield. Its liability is an annuity or a retirement fund, and they don't have the luxury of buying bonds yielding less than 1% or stocks that have no dividends. They need yield, and that's why they're going to come back. Commercial real estate is still paying a 4 to 7, 8% cash on cash yield. Next slide. And so to put all that in summary, I'm going to tell you just 4 things you need to watch, and you can be just as crazy as the Red Shoe Economist. Number 1, follow that Tsa Passenger Count. As that climbs, and if we get to 1 million, let's say by the 4th of July, and we get to 1.5 million by Labor Day weekend, we really are getting there. This will be the most predictive overall metric that everybody should monitor. Number 2 is what's called loans transferred to special servicers. Before loans go delinquent, before they get foreclosed, whether it's in a bank or CMBS world, they get transferred to either the special assets or special servicing department. And we're seeing those numbers climb rapidly. It's really bad in lodging. It's gone from around 2% in March to over 16%. This is really telling you about the health of commercial real estate and its ability to service debt. Third one I just talked about, CRE transaction activity, and I predict that's going to come back strong this fall. And I've already talked about corporate earnings, incredible nuggets of information there for you in those earnings. Next slide. So this is the graphic that I would say print out and paste to your bathroom mirror and by your bedside at night. And I want you to think about it every morning and when you get up and every night when you go to bed. This is what we are going to be called upon as CCIMs to answer. Everybody's trying to figure out what happens to commercial real estate values. This chart is what I worked for every pre-FOMC meeting in 2008, 9, and 10 at the New York Fed. And what we wanted to know was how much more capital, how much more TARP money are we going to have to put in the banks? How bad is it going to get? And so what we saw at the beginning of the Great Recession was cap rates sheared upward from 6% to 8% in like 6 quarters. And the reason was that was a liquidity crisis. Nobody would lend anybody. Nobody trusted anybody. And so the Fed was slow to respond to interest rate reductions and intervening policy like we've done much more quickly this time. Then what that did is that 6 to 8% cap rate, it eliminated 25% of commercial real estate values. Boom, right out of the box. Then over the next 3 years, we saw the decline in NOI, the rising vacancy rates, the decline in rents, all of that happened. This time around, I don't think we're going to see that happen. I don't think we're going to see cap rates shear sharply up because the Fed's put too much liquidity. If the Fed doesn't like the pricing of something right now, it's going to intervene and buy it and reset the price at a lower number. So I think cap rates and interest rates are going to stay low, and we're not going to see a big movement in cap rates. Where we are going to see the pricing changes in NOI as we have more expenses, less density utilization. We're going to have to refigure out rent, expense ratios, occupancy costs, all of that type stuff. And I think we're going to see the biggest decline in NOI in property types, including multifamily, that we've probably seen in a post-World War II era. And what I think it all means is we lose 20 to 25% of commercial real estate values over a 3-year period. In the Great Recession, the red box at the bottom, 40%. That's what we lost over about 4 years from 2008 to 2012. I don't think we're going there. I think the decline will be less for multifamily and warehouse, maybe only 5 to 10%. And it's going to be really severe for hotel and retail in the 50 to 70% range. This chart will be different for every market and every property type. Your ability to translate this to your clients and your property and your communities will really distinguish you in terms of understanding the price adjustments that we're going to see. Next slide. So you have a lot of agriculture in your region. So I recently did a podcast with Realtor Land Institute on all the various types from residential to agricultural and ranching and pasture land. So here's that and the link to it. The next slide gives you the transcript. So I know we have too many podcasts to listen to. So if you want to kind of figure out what did we cover and what questions were asked, here's the kind of the queue up from Justin Osborne. So you can screen it before you have to spend 45 more minutes of time with Casey, the Red Shoe Economist. Next slide. There's some great resources if you've got agriculture and land to look at. NACREIF, the National Council of Real Estate Independent Fiduciaries, they have an overall index that they look at for commercial real estate. They also have one for farmland. And for the first time since 2001, there was a quarterly decline in farmland values in the last quarter. And that's, you know, a 20-year thing that hasn't happened. So it's showing you, and the biggest reason is it's supply chain disruption. You know, dairy farmers couldn't get milk processed into the processing areas, so they had to dump it. A lot of crops had to just be plowed under. Cattle stock couldn't get to meat packing plants and processing and slaughter plants because of the outbreak of the virus. So NACREIF is a good one. This is the institutional money in land, in agricultural land, will blow your mind away. It's in the trillions of dollars. So this is a great resource to look at that. Next slide. Let's talk logistics now. So you're in a region that's really, I think, going to see some changes in supply chain. So to date, we've seen a supply chain that's moved from West Coast, LA, Long Beach, to the east and through your region. So a lot of warehousing there, and all the empty containers come back to LA. I think we're going to see a reversal of that. So on the right here, this is an article by Forbes that in February noted that Port Laredo in Texas surpassed LA and Long Beach as the busiest container port. So this is before the outbreak. You can't blame it on no containers coming from China yet. And I think we're going to see more of this accelerate as the rest of the world decides that it's not going to put all of its eggs in one basket in China for manufacturing everything from pharmaceuticals to PPE to auto parts, you name it. And we're going to reshore manufacturing activity. Don't look for a ton of it to come back to the United States, but look for a ton of it to go to Mexico. And the reason is in Mexico, you can permit a new plant and you don't much more quicker than the US without local government delays and an EPA that makes you go through years of studies. So the paper I wrote a year and a half ago called Logistics Infrastructure really was a good setup for this. If you want to read it, the link is there. I really talked about how we're moving from a shop and take home economy to an order line and deliver. And our supply chain is going to change more from a west to east movement to a north south, and your region is going to be a big beneficiary of that. Next slide. So the other thing that's going to change, I call in logistics and warehousing, is we're going to have logistics 2.0. So just like after the financial crisis and Great Recession, we had CMBS 2.0 to fix all the permanent finance problems that we had in the securitization market. I think we're going to see the same in logistics. It's not just going to be more movement north-south from west to east, but we also are going to need to automate the dickens out of everything. The value of that box and what goes into that warehouse box is going to change dramatically. It may shock many of you to know that almost 50% of all the activity we do in warehousing today is still a manual process. Fulfillment, all of those things are manual, the returns and everything. So we're going to see tremendous growth in autonomous vehicles. Florida became the first state to fully integrate autonomous trucking this year. The next states are Texas and Arizona. And your region is ideally set to really advance autonomous trucking and what it means for warehousing. So look for the technologies to change dramatically. Next slide. So another logistics item besides TSA that I track that's important for your region because of all the rail activity is on the American Association of Railroads rail time indicators. And I put the March number in here rather than the April and May. April and May are just terrible, worse than March. But there's a note I have at the bottom called demand shock. So remember I told you 1 in 4 small businesses are gone and 40% of restaurants are gone. What do you think is going to happen to all the supplies and the orders they had that are now on rail or trucks coming to their business, and they get there and they're closed and no one's there to receive them? We're going to have to store that somewhere. And so it's a new cost, and they're not going to clutter up our big e-commerce warehouses. All your great Prologis warehouses in your regions are not going to be cluttered up with not going to clutter up their throughput e-commerce with this demand shock. So they're going to look to secondary and tertiary markets and assets like maybe empty retail, an empty big box, an empty JCPenney's, that they could put this stuff until they find a new buyer or market for it. And they're going to use demand shock as a way to figure out supply stock. So we're going to get rid of just-in-time inventory, and we're going to have excess inventory. That's a new cost. It doesn't need to be touched every day, and it doesn't need to clutter up e-commerce fulfillment. So they're going to be looking in secondary and tertiary markets that are in proximity to markets with good rail, that have interstate, that maybe they could buy a cheap, say, former Dave & Buster's or a furniture showroom or a Toys R Us or a department store, and they could put additional supply stock. So this is adaptive reuse. It's what I call daily user adaptive reuse. I'm already seeing it in companies that are set up where they're putting out bid requests to brokers to help them find former closed retail that could be used for demand and supply stock. So for leasing and transactions, it's a great opportunity for you. Next slide. So here's an example of one of them. This is outside Atlanta. It's a former Dave & Buster's with an adjoining Haverty's furniture outlet that went under. And this entity just bought it to facilitate more last mile distribution and supply stock. It's near a failed mall, great interstate location. Think about, I-25, I-75, or I-70. Think of all your interstates and your failing suburban malls and this ancillary retail that's around there. It's ideal for this type of stuff. Last mile solutions, supply stock. So this is what I call daily driver adaptive reuse. It's not historic. It doesn't require a lot of change. It's pretty basic, easy stuff to do. So here's a good example. Next slide. So let's talk leisure and travel industry, leisure and tourism. Your region has some of the best in the country. I grew up in Colorado. My dad was a land guy for Vail, so I know your ski resorts and your mountain areas. And my 2 favorite resorts where half my ashes are going to be placed is the Broadmoor in outside Phoenix, and the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, and the Biltmore down in Phoenix. So you have real tentacles to this. This is very important to your region. This is a piece I wrote, and the numbers are just plain ugly. I can't sugarcoat it any other way. In the middle, I've got a yellow arrow there pointing to a quote by Real Capital Analytics. They do the best job tracking commercial real estate transaction down to the MSA level. And in April, there were only 10 hotel transactions nationwide. That broke a record from April 2009, where there were only 21. And the quote from Real Capital Analytics head person Jim Costello was, "We have never seen this level of illiquidity in the hotel market. It is effectively a frozen marketplace." The CCIM skill set is going to be called upon to really help the leisure and travel industry. And it's not just hotels. Think about your theme parks. So Six Flags. When I grew up in Colorado, it was Elitch Gardens. But think about all your amusement parks and theme parks and concert venues and outdoor venues. They're all tremendously affected, and we're going to have to figure out what they're worth, how we reprice them, how we deal with the debt and the bonds. And so if you go to the next slide, This expands on maybe what leisure and travel and hotel are going to look like in the future. I was able to interview the CEOs of Marriott and Hilton and participate in their earnings calls. And they pointed out several things. They said, first of all, we're going to build smaller, less dense hotels going forward. We're not going to build these mega convention center type hotel assets any further. So for markets like Las Vegas or Orlando or Dallas, Atlanta, San Francisco, this really spells some concern for those big convention hotels. Number two is they said, we're going back to the future. How do y'all like exterior entry motels? Remember that station wagon? We would pull up that Clark Griswold and Family Vacation, and they'd have a balcony on an exterior entry. They're saying, look, we don't have areas to clean, and we don't have virus concerns or future flu concerns. They said, we're going to have to spend a ton of money on CapEx in these hotels to go contactless everything. So think about a check-in where there is no check-in desk anymore. It's all on your phone and all an app. Think about when you get to your room and there's a cellophane wrapper that you have to break and enter, and your QR code on your phone will open it. And when you arrive inside, you're not going to have your bed made or your linens put out. There's going to be a package, sealed package that has your linens and your towels, and you're going to have to open it up and make your bed and put your towels out. It's going to change dramatically. And how does a hotel function if we have municipalities say you can only have max 50% occupancy? The whole numbers have to change again. And what I want to point out to you is a note I have there on the right. These occupancy restrictions that are being implemented in California and Colorado and Florida that are going beyond temporary to permanent, they are essentially a type of eminent domain. It's taking part of your property without compensation. And so I see coming ahead some eminent domain type actions against cities and states on these occupancy orders. And that's what it's going to take to really figure it out. And guess who they're going to call on for expert witnesses and studies and advice? It's going to be people like CCIMs that have all of that great training and skill set. So here's another area where you may be able to make make a living in consulting and expert witness. There's lots of areas while we wait for transactions to fully reboot. Next slide. Here's just the charts and showing the hotel decline and the rise in loans to special servicing. So you can see it's really ugly in lodging and retail, and it's not so bad in industrial and multifamily. So don't look for a lot of workout activity in industrial multifamily assets. There's just not going to be the distressed debt there. Next slide. So housing, this is one where I mentioned earlier, we're not going to understand the tentacles to housing until next spring when we see these loan forbearance agreements come off. Remember in the 2009 housing crisis, we didn't have loan forbearance. We pretty much went straight to foreclosure. And so this time's very different. The realtors were a little slow recognizing that housing was going to be affected. In March and April, they were saying, hey, sales are great, they're still closing. Those were all contracts that were put in place in January and February pre-COVID. They've done a really good job pivoting. And there's an economist at the Realtors, Realtor.com, by the name of Danielle Hale. She started producing this weekly housing trends report, which is excellent. And it looks at more forward-looking indicators for housing, like listings and number of days on the market. And as those deteriorate, those are telling you, guess what changes last? Home prices. And so this is a precursor, and it's not showing us some good trends here. But this is a great housing resource if you're involved in that arena. Next slide. And here's what I mentioned earlier with the loan forbearance. Our mortgage delinquencies are off the charts. They've doubled from 3 to 6% in a period of time. Mississippi's worst in the nation at 12%, followed by New York and New Jersey. You guys are somewhere in the middle. You're looking at about 4% in most of your region, but that's up from 2% or 1.5% when you had no housing inventory 3-4 months ago. Next slide. So this is a graphic I think is really powerful that you can apply to any property type. And it gets you thinking how we could relate to our clients and our customers. So this was by the National Apartment Association, and it had this graphic that said, where does $1 of rent go? And think about where that $1 of rent is going to go next year. So if we have 93% of all multifamily properties have a Freddie Mac or Fannie or Freddie or GSE loan, they're probably under a loan forbearance agreement so they can give rent forbearance. And what that means is next year when we come off those agreements, their debt level is going to go up, their debt service is going to go up, their LTV is going to go up. So more of the dollars go for the financing and debt piece. Think about the janitorial and the tenant turnover costs. We're going to have to do more janitorial and maintenance at these properties. I've also recently had conversations with very, very large institutional owners of tens of thousands of apartment properties, and they're telling me one of the problems they're discovering is to release an apartment. They're having to recarpet and redo soft surfaces like drapes because nobody wants a apartment that may have COVID lurking in the carpet. So that just added about $2,000 to the tenant turnover costs of a unit. So if more has to go through for tenant turnover and maintenance, guess what's left at the end of the day? A whole lot less NOI for the owner. And that's why I think that earlier slide, NOI is going to go down, cap rate's not going to go up, but apply this to every property type. Think about where the dollar of rent and NOI ends up and where it's going. And I think we're going to see it's changing a lot. In multifamily, I think that we're going to see less stress in workforce multifamily. So think about your downtown markets, think of a Denver, a Phoenix, a Salt Lake, Las Vegas. That urban housing, that workforce housing is probably going to do okay, but student housing is being decimated. So when you look at 138 college towns where no students are returning to campus from the spring or this summer, or maybe not this fall, and what that means in terms of that housing, I think it's gonna be a lot harder hill to climb. I also think we're going to see more opportunity in the multifamily, just like office. We're finding that remote work and Zoom works fine. So I have a reluctance in my millennial daughters, they don't want to get on public transportation. They don't want to live in the urban city anymore. They don't want to do experiential retail unless it's on Zoom. They don't really want to experience it in physical reality. And so I think that's going to be a beneficiary for the suburbs. And I'm already seeing this in transactions. We're seeing huge amounts of properties being marketed and put under contract that are suburban apartments. And they're willing to buy those now, spend the next 6 months doing value add, and have them ready to be on the market next spring. So I think that's where the opportunity is going to be, again, in the suburbs. Next slide. So when we get there, what's there going to look like? So on the left, this great graphic that Visual Capitalist, if you want a great way to visualize data, Esri does the best job, but aside from Esri, Visual Capitalist does a great job. And they have this graphic of Zoom, this little eclectic tech company that most of us didn't understand a year ago or use. And Zoom today has a market capitalization greater than the seven largest airlines in the world with 1% the workforce. So most of those 7 largest airlines in the world used a lot of us to do business travel. And if now we don't need to do that because we can do Zoom, what does our world look like with less airports or less flights and Zoom with 1% the workforce? It's going to be very different. The other one to think about is fast food and casual dining in our restaurants. So before COVID, Chick-fil-A, as example, was redoing most of its freestanding restaurants. They were tearing down the old ones. They were moving it from the center of the site to the back of the site to allow more drive-through. They were putting in 2 kitchens, one dedicated just for drive-through. They developed a great app that works so much better than the touchless screens, self-service kiosks at McDonald's. And what the Chick-fil-A stores have found that have reopened or that stayed open and had gone through this renovation and only did drive-through with 2, 3, 4 lanes and ability to service 1,000 customers an hour through drive-through, is that their sales went up 10 to 20%. And the rest of the casual dining industry is studying the heck out of the Chick-fil-A model. They're taking pictures of their stores, they're studying the numbers, and they're trying to figure out how they can replicate it. Unfortunately for many, like a Taco Bell with 1 drive-through on a half-acre site, you can't do much with it. So what's a Taco Bell restaurant worth on a half acre? Probably not a lot. What does a McDonald's do? We've already saw McDonald's was redoing a lot of its stores, and they thought they were pretty smart adding, 2 drive-through order stations, but it was in the same drive-through lane. So they didn't solve a problem like Chick-fil-A's done. But I think we're going to see casual dining change a lot, and I think the Chick-fil-A model is a preview of what there might look like in casual dining. Next slide. So believe it or not, we got there. We're near the end. So what do I see is the future, and what's it going to take for us to fully get there? The answer is something called immunity passports. They're already being used in Europe. Germany's fully open. Their soccer clubs are playing games in stadiums again. And basically, you have to have an immunity passport to go to a public event, to go to work, to get on an airplane, to go to a soccer game. And we have a better model that will work for us here in the US. It's called the CLEAR system. So those of you that travel, paid a little bit more because everybody figured out TSA PreCheck and we went to CLEAR to go to the next level. CLEAR was a technology that was developed for medical records. And CLEAR already has all of our medical records. They just can't share them because of the HIPAA laws. So if Congress just passes the law, changes the legislation to allow that information to be integrated as part of an immunity passport situation, guess what? We've given up all of our medical privacy. We already did anyway. If you thought any of it was private, you're crazy. If you get a prescription filled online, you've lost all of your privacy. But we will have all of that so that I'm a diabetic. So I do finger sticks each day and put this test strip in my glucose monitor, and it tells me what I can do and if I'm good for the day. Or I now do it on a device on my arm with my phone and an app. We're going to have something like that. We're going to have these little test kits that we buy at our drugstore or Walmart that cost about $5 or $10, and it'll have a swab. And they'll give us all these equivalent of the glucose monitor, and we'll swab our mouths or our noses, and we'll put it in this little device, and it'll give us a reading that says, hey, you don't have the flu. You don't have the new strain of the flu. You don't have COVID. You don't have all these other things. You can go to work. You can get on an airplane. You can go to a Denver Broncos game if they ever figure out how to win again. They need to become more like Kansas City Chiefs, right? I should have put my Kansas City Chiefs hat on, the KC hat. Or the Arizona football teams, any of your great football teams. But anyway, that's how we're going to get there. How long is it going to take? Think about 9/11. It took us 3 years to develop Homeland Security, TSA, and getting comfortable taking our shoes off. We're probably looking at a 3-year process. And so even if we get a vaccine the end of this year, how many of you are signing up to be one of the first 1 million, 5 million, or 10 million guinea pigs to take that vaccine? Not me. I'll wear a mask. I want to see how the first 5 million of you do with the vaccine. So the vaccine is going to take fully with production well into next year to really be implemented. These immunity passports will come along. The vaccine will also give us the ability to do the testing. We got to ramp up the testing. So that's how I see us getting not just beyond COVID, but future public health crises. All these flu viruses that emanate out of China every year because of their wet markets and their bad food safety processing, all of those are going to change. And we're going to use this lesson from COVID to really learn how to deal with public health. We spent a decade thinking we were doing risk management to be prepared for a pandemic. And what we learned was we were clueless. And we now understand the tentacles. And I think what gets us there is immunity passport. The thing is occupancy monitoring technology. Whether it's in office buildings or hotels, we're going to have this technology that we're going to have to spend money on that makes everything touchless and tells us who's been where. So if somebody does develop an illness or something that's a public health crisis, a tuberculosis outbreak or whatever, because people aren't doing immunizations anymore, we'll be able to follow that and track that very thoroughly. So I think we get there. It's probably a 3-year process. I think a lot of economic damage is done. There are encouraging signs. Like I said, I looked down the other day in my red shoes and I saw some little green sprouts coming out, and those were retail sales and Dick's Sporting Goods reinstating their dividend. So these are encouraging things for us to be hopeful about, but we're a long ways from being there. And I encourage you to be patient. I encourage you to be adaptive with your skill set, because you may need to do consulting or litigation support or other things until transactions come back. Know you have the skill set. Know the CCIM Institute is just crushing it over any other industry group to really provide you the education, skills, and resources. And anything I can do, I'm glad to do that. So we'll stop there, Kelly, and see if anybody has any questions, or they're already looking for their immunity passport.
Thank you, Casey. As the supply chain recovers, share with us your thoughts about future inflation. We've put a lot of money into the economy. How's that going to be affected?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So I didn't want to scare you, but the Fed chairman acknowledged that what we're doing today and growing the balance sheet is really scary, and we have no precedent to know how to deal with it or how to unwind it. Think back to 2018. The Fed thought it could unwind QE. It was starting to pay down the balance sheet. It thought it could raise interest rates back to 3%. What happened in December when we got that fourth rate hike? We had a tantrum. We collapsed the market and they had to stop. That was with 4 trillion. Now we're talking something that's going to go over 10 trillion. So we forget that inflation comes from 2 sources. The first is commodity and asset prices, and those are going down right now. We've seen devaluation in those. The second, though, is your currency. And if the medium of exchange becomes less valuable because we know you're printing money, what happens? We've seen this in Latin debt crises. We saw it in Germany after World War I, where their exchange between the dollar went from 12 marks to the dollar to 4.2 trillion in 3 years. We've seen it in Argentina. We've seen it in Brazil. This doesn't end well. And keep in perspective, the Fed doesn't make anything and it doesn't sell anything. So where does it suddenly find trillions of dollars more to go buy assets? It calls its friends at Treasury and says, you know that printing machine you have? Can you print me another trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, 10 trillion? It's inflationary. We're increasing the money supply. Now, fortunately, the rest of the world's doing the same thing. Europe's figured out what we're doing, and they said, hey, we can do that too. We can do deficit spending. My concern is that when we get 3 years out from this and we have immunity passports and we're getting back to normal and we have to unwind all this and we have to suck all this liquidity out and we have to tax more to pay down this debt and this deficit spending, it could put us into a really difficult situation. And it could be inflationary if we ignore it as the dollar devalues. There's a piece I share sometimes by a friend of mine called by the name of John Liftlander, and he wrote a piece on it's called How Monetary Policy Affects Commercial Real Estate Values. It's a chronology of fiat currencies over the last 2,000 years that have failed because they just printed money. I hope we don't end up there, but it's something we need to think about. And even Chairman Powell acknowledged it in his April press conference when he said, we're doing all this stuff. And he said, don't even ask me about interest rates. Don't even ask me about what we're doing in my intervention in my balance sheet. I have to first fix and intervene to stop workforce destruction. If I don't do that and we end up with 30 or 40% unemployment like the Great Depression, we're screwed. That's a technical economic term. We're screwed. we're in bad shape. So he says, I'm dealing with that problem first. And in 3 years from now, I'll deal with how do I unwind it. But great question, because I think we have an unintended inflationary consequence coming from devaluing our dollar.
Thank you so much, KC. And if we can also take a moment to recognize all of the sponsors of the chapters in our region. Thanks to their year-round support, we are able to bring you programming like this and all of the other exceptional events you've come to rely on. I invite you all to connect with your local chapter and join our local CCIM and commercial real estate community. Thank you so much for attending and have a great day.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Casey.
Be safe.